Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive.
Right.
And this time we are going to be looking at a book called Nature, Man, and Woman
Oh, this is a good one.
by Alan Watts. Have you read this one before?
I have, yeah. It's one of
Yeah.
those that you kind of keep coming back to every
Oh,
few years
yeah.
and get
Yeah.
something new out of it.
I know Alan Watts from like The Way of Zen
Yeah.
and some of his other works and lectures. He's got a really interesting way of looking at Eastern philosophy and
Mm.
kind of making it accessible to Western audiences.
Yeah, he's got a real knack for taking these ancient ideas and making them feel relevant to modern life.
So, nature, man, and woman, what is it we're going to be looking at today?
So in this book, Watts is really exploring the relationship between humanity and nature, but through this lens of how our culture, particularly in the West, shapes our views on spirituality, relationships, and even our own bodies.
I think a lot of us can relate to that feeling of being like separate from nature, even though we know logically that we're a part of it.
Exactly. And Watts really gets at that disconnect. He even uses a personal anecdote about his own experience with Christianity. He talks about how he only really feels Christian when he's inside a church building. But as soon as he steps outside into the natural world, it's like the religion doesn't fit anymore.
It's like we've built this wall between spirit and nature, and we're stuck on the spirit side trying to pretend the other side doesn't exist.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And Watts would argue that this separation is at the root of a lot of our modern anxieties. We end up afraid of our own bodies, uncomfortable with natural processes like death and decay. It creates this sense of alienation from the very world that sustains us.
We become strangers in our own home.
Exactly. And it's not just an individual problem, it impacts our relationships too.
So where do we even begin to break down this wall? If we want to find a way to feel more connected to nature, more at home in our own bodies, where do we start?
Well, Watts suggests we look to the East, particularly to Taoist philosophy. There's this concept called Wu Wei, which is often translated as effortless action or non-doing.
Non-doing. I
Yeah.
like that.
It sounds paradoxical, but it's really about aligning ourselves with the natural flow of things instead of constantly trying to impose our will on the world. It's about working with the grain, so to speak.
So instead of trying to force things to happen, it's more about like going with the flow, like being in harmony with nature instead of trying to dominate it.
Exactly. Watts uses the example of a skilled craftsman. They don't shape wood by brute force, but by understanding its grain and working with its natural properties. Or think of an athlete who moves with effortless grace. They're not fighting against their body or the environment. They're moving in sync with it.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between effort and ease.
Exactly. And Watts believes that this approach can apply to our inner world as well. We can learn to observe our thoughts and emotions with the same kind of open, non-judgmental awareness that we might bring to watching a sunset or listening to the wind in the trees.
That makes me think of Quan, that other Taoist concept
Oh, yeah.
that Watts talks about. It's about cultivating this state of open awareness, just observing without getting caught up in our thoughts.
Right. Quant is about cultivating a state of receptivity, where we're simply observing without getting caught up in the chatter of our minds. He even tells this great story about a Zen master who tells his student to laugh because when a cow in Kwaichou grazes the herbage, a horse in Aichu finds its stomach filled.
Wait, what does that even mean? I mean,
Yeah, it's a head scratcher.
how is a horse?
It's a bit of a Zen koan, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's meant to make you think.
Yeah.
What the master is doing is highlighting the interconnectedness of everything. The master is showing that even seemingly unrelated events are part of a larger web. And sometimes the best way to understand these connections isn't through analyzing, but through direct experience, that koan.
I guess it's like, even though we think of things as separate, they're all part of this larger whole.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the body. Watts was really concerned about how we view and treat our bodies in Western culture.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier, that discomfort we have with our physical selves. Like we're trying to escape being human.
Right. We tend to see our bodies as these, limitations, these sources of pain and decay. We try to detach from them, identify more with our minds. But Watts challenges us to see the body as a source of ecstasy. He argues that embracing our physicality, even the parts that make us uncomfortable, can lead to a deeper, richer experience of life.
So instead of trying to transcend our bodies, maybe the path to a more fulfilling life is actually through embracing them more fully.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where Watts introduces this concept that he calls the world as nonsense.
Nonsense. Does that mean like meaningless, like nothing matter?
No, not at all. He's not saying life is meaningless. What he's saying is that the world can't be completely grasped or understood by our rational minds. There's always an element of mystery, of something that transcends our ability to explain it.
So it's about recognizing the limits of our thinking. Like, there's always more to experience than what our minds can grasp.
Exactly. Watts uses this beautiful example of his garden being completely transformed at twilight. Couldn't describe it in words, but he felt this sense of awe and wonder that transcended language.
It's like sometimes you just have to experience something to really understand it.
Yeah.
You can't just think your way into it.
Yeah, sometimes words just aren't enough, and this idea of nonsense ties into the Taoist view of nature as a constantly changing web of relationships, not a collection of separate, static things that we can control and categorize.
Right. It's about seeing the world as this interconnected whole where everything is in flux, everything is related. And that leads us, I think, to the topic of sexuality.
Ah, yes, a topic that Western culture has a lot of, well, baggage around.
And Watts definitely doesn't shy away from addressing that baggage.
No, he doesn't. He dedicates a whole section to what he calls the confusions of sexuality.
So how does he see those confusions playing out?
Watts observes that Western culture tends to swing between these two extremes with sexuality. Either we see it as something shameful, something to be repressed, or we treat it as purely about pleasure, completely disconnected from its deeper potential.
Yeah, like we're stuck in this pendulum swing between prudishness and like this kind of empty hedonism.
And Watts traces this confusion back through history, looking at the influence of Christianity, the concept of pure desire, even these ancient practices like coitus reservatus.
Okay, wait. Coitus reservatus? What's that?
It's a technique that involves restraining the male orgasm, allowing sexual energy to kind of build and diffuse throughout the body without release. Now, Watts isn't advocating for this specifically,
Yeah.
but he uses it as an example of how different cultures have approached sexuality throughout history.
So it's about like expanding our understanding of what's possible.
Right. It highlights how some cultures have attempted to personalize desire, making it about more than just the physical act.
And that brings us to this contrast with like the modern Christian ideal of marriage.
Exactly. The modern view of marriage attempts to reconcile personal love with sexuality. But even then, Watts thinks it still doesn't quite get it right.
So what's wrong with the modern view of marriage according to Watts?
He argues that it tries to elevate a human romantic relationship to the level of divine love, but in doing so, it ends up creating a kind of imitation, a parody of the real thing.
Like we're trying to force something that's finite and human into this box of the infinite and divine.
You got it. And to really understand his critique, we have to dive into the work of another thinker, Denis de Rougemont, and his ideas about love in the Western world.
Okay, we are going deep here. This is fascinating stuff. Let's save that for the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back. So we were about to get into Denis de Rougemont, right? This guy who wrote a whole book about love in the Western world.
Yes, de Rougemont had some pretty interesting ideas about love. What was it Watts picked up on?
Well, de Rougemont believed that mature love was all about complete devotion to another person. Giving yourself fully to your beloved. But here's the thing. He wasn't a big fan of passion.
Really? Why not? Seems like passion's kind of important for love.
Well, de Rougemont saw passion as kind of an immature infatuation. He thought it was all about delaying gratification, especially, sexual gratification. For him, true love was more of a spiritual connection.
So he's saying, like, keep the physical stuff out of it. But didn't Watts have a different take on that?
He did. Watts thought that separating passion from true love was kind of an artificial construct. Remember, he's coming from this Taoist perspective where the physical and spiritual aren't really seen as separate things.
Right. It's all about finding that balance between the two. But how did Watts square that with de Rougemont's ideas?
Well, Watts actually suggested that it was through the tradition of courtly love, with all its emphasis on passion and romance, that Christianity even started to develop this modern concept of married love.
That's interesting. So this tradition that de Rougemont was criticizing actually influenced the very ideal he was promoting.
Exactly. It's kind of a paradox, right? And then Watts goes on to say that maybe the church, by rejecting some of its own mystical traditions, what he calls the inner doctrine, actually paved the way for secularism and a decline in traditional values.
Hold on, inner doctrine. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. Watts is talking about this mystical side of Christianity that's all about directly experiencing God, going beyond rules and rituals. He believes this aspect got kind of pushed aside in favor of a more, rigid interpretation of faith.
So instead of embracing the mystery, they focused on rules and dogma. And that created this divide between the spiritual and the secular.
That's Watt's take. And he thinks that rejecting this inner doctrine left a void that secularism rushed in to fill, often in ways that missed the mark.
Like, we lost the language to talk about the deeper parts of life.
Exactly. And all of this ties back into this idea of confusing the sacred with the profane. When we try to find ultimate fulfillment in a human relationship like marriage, it's like we're trying to turn something finite into something infinite.
So Watts isn't anti-marriage. She's just saying it's not the whole picture.
Exactly. It's about understanding that human love, while beautiful and important, can't fully satisfy that longing for something bigger than ourselves.
Okay, that makes sense. But it also raises the question, if not through marriage, then how do we find that connection with the sacred?
Well, Watts believed that we've been looking in the wrong places. He says that the sacred isn't separate from us, something we have to earn. It's already here, in the natural world, in our bodies, in the fabric of existence.
So instead of trying to escape our bodies and the natural world, maybe the path to the sacred is actually through embracing them.
That's a great way to put it. And, it all goes back to this idea of equality in the sight of God. Not that we're all equally messed up, but that we all have this spark of the divine in us.
It's about seeing the inherent worth in everyone, regardless of their flaws.
Exactly. And that leads us to Watts's thoughts on what he calls the obscene, or the hidden parts of human nature. Now, he's not condoning bad behavior, but he's saying that trying to suppress these shadow parts of ourselves can actually lead to more problems.
So instead of denying them, maybe we need to find a way to integrate those shadow parts into a more holistic understanding of who we are.
That's the challenge he presents us with. And he uses a passage from Colossians where it talks about the new man, where there's no distinction between people based on their background or status, to illustrate this.
It's a vision of unity and acceptance that goes beyond our usual judgments, which brings us back to this idea of nonsense, that we can't fully grasp reality with just our rational minds.
Exactly. Watts believed that we need to embrace the mystery, the paradox, the nonsense of it all, letting go of our need to control everything and allow ourselves to be surprised by the world.
It's like rediscovering that childlike sense of wonder.
Exactly. But how do we do that as adults? After we've been conditioned to think and act in certain ways.
Well, Watts talks about practices like Kan, that open awareness we discussed earlier. It's about being present without judgment, without forcing our will on things. And that applies not just to our individual lives, but to our relationships too. So how does nonsense play out in relationships?
It means letting go of our ideas about how things should be and letting the relationship unfold naturally, embracing the messiness, the ups and downs, all of it.
It's about accepting our partners for who they are and giving them space to grow.
Exactly. And Watts really emphasizes communication, really listening to your partner, not just with your ears, but with your heart.
Creating a space for real intimacy where you can both be vulnerable.
Yes. And Watts would say that vulnerability is actually a sign of strength, not weakness.
It reminds me of what he said about strength coming from flexibility, not rigidity.
Right. It's about embracing that paradox, the nonsense, and remembering that we can't control everything. Sometimes the most beautiful things happen when we let go.
So in relationships, this means being open to being surprised, to being challenged, to growing along with your partner.
Beautifully said. And that's where I think Watts' insights are so powerful. They invite us to approach relationships with curiosity, playfulness, a willingness to embrace the unknown.
It's about remembering that love isn't a static thing. It's a dynamic process. This dance that's always evolving and showing us something new.
Exactly. Watts reminds us that self-discovery isn't a solo journey. It's something we do in connection with others, with nature, with the mystery of life itself.
It's an invitation to live more fully, to love more deeply, to experience the world with that sense of wonder we maybe had as children but lost along the way.
And who knows? Maybe by embracing the nonsense, integrating the masculine and feminine within ourselves, we can start to heal that rift between spirit and nature that Watts talked about.
That's a beautiful vision. A more harmonious, compassionate, alive world. But wow, we've covered a lot in this deep dive. Watts brings together so many different ideas.
He does. He challenges our assumptions about everything. The world, ourselves, each other.
Speaking of each other, I'm curious to hear more about what Watts had to say about the dynamics between men and women and how we can use his insights to build better relationships.
That's a great question. And it's a perfect place to pick up in the next part of our deep dive. See you then.
Welcome back to the show. I'm really excited to dive into this last part with you.
Me too.
We've been talking about all these big ideas, this feeling of separation from nature and all of these cultural assumptions that shape our views. But I'm really interested in hearing more about what Watts had to say about the dynamics between men and women.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting.
Mm.
Because Watts takes all these ideas we've been discussing, the spirit and nature divide, the importance of Quan, even the nature of desire,
Mm.
and he applies them to this dance between the masculine and the feminine.
And if I remember correctly, he really challenges those traditional ways of thinking about
Oh, yeah,
masculinity and femininity.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. In Western culture, we tend to associate masculinity with, the spirit, the intellect, control,
Right.
while femininity is linked to nature, the body, emotions. It's like we've created these boxes,
Yeah.
these rigid roles that limit how we're supposed to behave and express ourselves.
Yeah. It's like men are from Mars, women are from Venus.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And Watts argues that these rigid roles actually hurt everyone.
Right.
They keep both men and women from,
Yeah.
fully being themselves.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. It's not just about gender roles. It's about recognizing that these categories are kind of artificial.
Right.
They're not like natural laws.
Exactly. Watts suggests that we move beyond those limited definitions and find a way to integrate the masculine and feminine within each of us.
Within each of us.
Yeah, regardless of our gender.
Okay, so how do we even begin to do that? Like, where do we start?
Well, remember that concept of wu-wei we talked about? That effortless action. Watts believed that applies to relationships too.
Okay, so instead of trying to like force our partners to fit some ideal, maybe it's about learning to accept them for who they are.
Yeah, meeting them with that same kind of open, receptive awareness.
That sounds amazing, but also like really challenging. How do we cultivate that kind of acceptance?
Yeah.
Especially when, things get tough in a relationship.
Well, I think Watts would say that it starts with vulnerability.
Okay.
Be willing to let down your defenses, to be seen, to really listen to your partner. Not just hearing the words, but like trying to understand their feelings.
Creating that safe space where both people feel heard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Watts would say that this kind of vulnerability,
Yeah.
it's actually a sign of strength, not weakness.
That reminds me of what he said about strength coming from flexibility,
Right.
not rigidity.
Exactly. It's about embracing that sense of nonsense,
Right.
that mystery and unpredictability that's always present in life and in our relationships.
It's like we're learning to dance with chaos instead of trying to control it.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And in that dance, we might just rediscover a sense of wonder and possibility.
So I guess what you're saying is that to have a truly fulfilling relationship, we need to be willing to be surprised, to be challenged, to grow alongside our partner.
Absolutely. And I think that's where Watts' insights are so valuable. They invite us to approach relationships with a sense of curiosity, playfulness,
Yeah.
a willingness to embrace the unknown.
It's about remembering that love isn't some static thing, it's a process.
Yeah.
This ever-evolving dance.
Beautifully said.
Okay, so for our listener out there who's trying to navigate all the complexities of love and relationships, what's the one thing you would say?
Based on Watts' teachings.
They should really take away from this.
Yeah, I think Watts would say, embrace the paradox, embrace the nonsense,
Okay.
let go of the need to control,
Yeah.
and be open to the mystery and beauty that unfolds when you approach life and love with an open heart.
That is a beautiful message. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Alan Watts' nature, man and woman.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found it insightful.
Yeah.
And maybe even a little bit challenging.
Challenging, yeah, but in a good way.
In a good way, definitely. And to our listener, thank you for being here with us. We'll see you next time on another deep dive.